Chang. Aron Chang is an urban designer and educator based in NOLA, who focuses on community-based planning and design. He co-leads the Water Leaders Institute with Tanya James, and is also co-founder of the Blue House Civic Studio, a cooperative focused on civic dialogue, placemaking, and multidisciplinary storytelling. So it's all yours, Aron. I will stop sharing my screen.
Hey, everyone. I'm thankful to be here with you all today. Thankful for this opportunity to connect with each of you and to share not just what I've been lucky to work on, but also thoughts on how it might possibly inform your work. I think 2020 for me, as I'm sure it's been for many people, has been a time for reflection and questioning and learning and hopefully change. And I think I come into this conversation today in that mindset of continuing to learn. I'm building this whole presentation around the question of power. And just the other day, I was in a conversation with Chief Sherelle Parfait Dardar, and she rejected the notion of power being the most important thing. She said, instead of power, what do we think about responsibility and accountability instead, to each other, to the land, to the water, to other species? And so all that is just to say that I'm in the space of hopefully challenging you all, but being challenged as well. If you guys don't mind, could you rename yourselves? I know everyone's been introducing themselves in chat, but if you're willing to also rename yourself in the chat box with your profession, that would be super helpful for me. Do that, so. Great, so we have planners, I think we have some engineers, we have designers, at least the folks that I know, the folks that, and also the folks who've, watershed resource analyst, community-based planner. Great, grad student. A retired fire captain, awesome. And as you do that, I just want to say, to me, this is really my professional community. I studied architecture, but I've really been working in planning and urban design for the past 12 years. I think for those of you that I know and those that I communicate with on a daily basis in this field of resilience planning and design, in the fields of climate adaptation, I think we generally think of ourselves as people who are doing good, right? I think we're also often highly educated. I think many of us are highly rational, thoughtful and deliberate people. And I think just given Sebastian's introduction and why you guys are all here today, that we share in awareness of the inequities that are so present in society, and that's a part of our work when we think about climate change, sea level rise, so on and so forth. One more interactive piece. Can you react with a thumbs up if you have recently used words like race and equity, inclusion, diversity, or justice in your documents, whether it's planning documents, project descriptions, grant applications? Thank you. So at least half. So cool. So almost everyone. So what I hope to communicate today is, in brief, that I think our work is profoundly political. I think our work as practitioners is a manifestation of existing power structures. I think our work perpetuates certain dynamics and also forecloses against others. Most importantly, I think our work provides an opportunity to change existing power structures. If we believe the status quo is not okay, if we know and believe that climate change will have a disproportionate impact on people of color and on low-income communities, then we have a chance. If we can recognize that, we have a chance to work differently. I'm going to share three quick images and ask people to respond. Just kind of, we'll take a second to look at the image and think about what it brings up for you. If you're interested in sharing it in the chat box, that would be great too. This is an image of a river crevasse. So a crevasse is when the high waters of the Mississippi breaks through the levees, these banks, and floods the surrounding floodplain area. So again, feel free to share in chat what this brings to mind for you, whether it's loss or devastation or something else. So as you're thinking about that, I would point out that, as I'm sure you can see in the words New Orleans plantation view, that levees have been built up over time actually to keep the river from flooding, and that in the pre-Civil War era, that levees were most often primarily built by enslaved people in order to protect the plantations and the communities that enslaved those people. And that after the Civil War, levees were often constructed with convict labor. And I think often of our water leaders co-lead Tanya James in a workshop with a bunch of designers and planners and saying, how do you think about levees? How do you represent levees? How do you draw them? How do you talk about them as a technology, as a line of defense, if you know that that's their history in the lower Delta? Another image, a few years ago, I was a project manager at Wagner and Ball, and I had the opportunity to work on one of the Rebuild by Design projects. I'm sure some of you probably worked on Rebuild by Design as well. So in the upper left are the kinds of images that we're familiar with, diagrams showing green infrastructure, new kinds of waterways and waterfronts, different kinds of lines of protection, raising of structures and roadways and critical infrastructure. In the image itself, this is Marina Village, a housing complex that was in the process of being demolished. And I'll never forget at a public meeting that was ostensibly about resilience and about climate change. The meeting came to a halt when a resident of Marina Village, which would be affected by the plans that we were developing, raised their hand. This was their one chance to connect with a lot of government officials from the city up to the state levels. And that person said, my kids are scared to walk to the bus stop because there are abandoned buildings and there's gaping holes in the doorways. And again, if you have thoughts on if that reflects experiences you've had in community engagement processes or any thoughts on that brief anecdote, feel free to share in chat. The third anecdote, just a few weeks ago, there's a photographer, Polo Silk, who was in this space with me, and we were talking about water management, we were talking about flooding, and he said that the government blew the levees, that barge, this infamous image of the barge breaking through the industrial canal flood wall and flooding the lower Ninth Ward in St. Bernard Parish, that wasn't the main cause, that the government actually blew the levees, blew the flood walls in order to flood the Ninth Ward, in order to protect uptown neighborhoods. And this is something I hear every single year. To this day, there are people, a lot of New Orleanians who believe that that's the case. That may sound absurd, but when you look back at the history of the Ninth Ward and you look back at the history of New Orleans as a whole, when you think about flooding in 1965 from Hurricane Betsy, when you look at the explosions that have taken place, whether it's the slow moving demolition and excavation of land to create the industrial canal that severed the Ninth Ward into two pieces, the upper and the lower, whether it's the Great Flood of 1927 and a downstream parish, St. Bernard and Plaquemines Parish, being sacrificed in order to protect New Orleans, which is upstream. That's the levee being blown by government officials, or whether it's the demolition of swamp and the dredging of a channel, the Mr. Go, Mississippi River Gulf Outlet, that's a lower right image, that these explosions are real things that have happened. And before I move on, I'll just quote briefly from Clyde Wood, who says, "The possibility and probability of the 2005 Katrina disaster was known for over 4 decades. The belief in the disposability of the lower Ninth Ward in particular, and African-American neighborhoods in general, was not the product of Black paranoia, but rather a key pillar of Bourbon philosophical thought and urban planning for over a century and a half." He goes on to say, "Neither a once-in-a-century natural catastrophe nor the most elaborate conspiracy theory can compete with the consequences of the daily workings of the Bourbon regime." So as we move on, I'm going to situate us and try to paint a complex picture of what's happening with water management here in the Delta, here in New Orleans, and hopefully use that as a single case study as a way for all of us to think about some of these power dynamics and what the politics of resilience planning and climate adaptation are. This is the context. This is a Mississippi River Delta. You can see the plume of sediment coming out of the Bird's Foot Delta. You can see that patch of gray, that's Greater New Orleans, that's 3 parishes, a hard patch of concrete and asphalt that is slowly sinking within this fluid Delta context. These are drawings in progress, but imagine a Delta pre-European colonization, a river that flows free, the movement of indigenous people along waterways and along waterfronts in relation to seasonal cycles, as well as the shifts in the river's course, in the course of bayous. And how over time, we've built up those levees, we've dredged up soil in order to form the lakefront. We've literally created the bowl that exists today when we think about a city where half of the land area is below sea level. And then we've put in place these pumps that drain this bowl, and that this is the present day landscape. So it's a radically different environment that we've created over time. An exercise that we like to do in the Water Leaders Institute is to help ourselves and help each other understand the relationship between all different kinds of storm events. So what we do, and this is based on a diagram I first saw by John Atkinson from Arcadis. So we'll ask, if we have a group of community participants, we'll ask everyone to share a story of a storm event and what impact it had on them. And what we do is we map them. Imagine each of these red dots as a story. We map them against the x-axis of recurrence. The one to the left are events that recur more frequently. To the right are events that occur less frequently. And then we also map them against the y-axis, which is cost and impact. So Hurricane Katrina or Betsy would be in the upper right. It happens rarely and has huge impact. And as we map this out, it becomes possible to see, it provides the intellectual framework for thinking about the relationship between a half of inch of rain falling over the course of a few hours and a cataclysmic event like Katrina. And to think about the different scales of infrastructure that we need at the neighborhood scale, at the watershed scale, and at the regional scale. And so it becomes a way of thinking about what is the relationship of my experience as a homeowner or a renter to the experience of a municipality, to the fact that the Delta as a whole is sinking and falling apart. So in this complex sinking landscape, we've put in place this drainage system. It consists of below ground culverts, as well as surface drainage canals, and massive pumps. We spend, in the city of New Orleans alone, over $50 million a year on drainage. What does that look like? These are the pumps. They were invented in the beginning of the 20th century. At the time, standing water, our inability to drain the landscape, was seen as a nuisance and a public health hazard. And so these pumps, the wood screw pumps, were the pride and joy. And this technology was exported around the world. And people would come to New Orleans just to study these incredible pumps that not only dried the streets out after it rained, but also allowed us to drain the swamps, which are now sinking. Yet despite that, we still flood. And this is what flooding can look like. There's, again, the cataclysmic flooding of Katrina, but there's also this kind of scene which occurs at least a couple times a year. We experience this kind of flooding. Trash cans tipped over, maybe a few hundred cars flooded out, inability to get to work or get to your own front door. The interesting thing is that as we pump, we also cause the ground to collapse. This former swampland drained, starts to compress, the organic materials oxidize, we lose volume, and then we build on top of it. You can see here a driveway, which isn't pile supported, collapsing, while the house, which is pile supported, stays relatively stable, again, on this former swampland. And you can see the homeowner, within the lifespan of the mortgage of this home, has had to build 2 steps just to get to their own front door, a house slab on grade. And then again, just as a reminder, this image of historic and projected land loss in Southeast Louisiana. So all this is in the context of deltaic coastal land loss. So we've been using stories. I'm going to try to share four quick stories and then use this to talk about some of the complexities of the situation. On August 5th, 2017, for those of you who live in New Orleans, everyone here remembers that day. It was a few inches of rain. It fell so fast that it caused significant flooding. And it also led to significant political upheaval. For the first time in my experience, water became a primary topic of the mayoral elections. The general superintendent of the Surgeon Water Board was fired. The head of the Surgeon Water Board resigned. The communications director also resigned. And there was a quick casting about for scapegoats, and the blame was put squarely upon the Surgeon Water Board. Malfunctioning equipment, things under repair, and that was the general narrative. These are some of the images, some of the headlines, and you can see in the bottom right, a year after August 5th flood, trusting Surgeon Water Board remains a challenge. From 2011 to 2013, I was lucky to work on the Greater New Orleans Urban Water Plan. That was a federally funded effort. HUD funded it. And it was a chance for a design team of both New Orleans and Louisiana based, as well as Dutch, Rotterdam and Amsterdam based designers to think about how to reimagine our relationship to water, in particular rainfall. And out of that came a set of strategies around slowing down, storing rainfall instead of pumping it all. So in technical terms, detention, retention, really focuses on integrating green infrastructure at multiple scales into the urban landscape in order to reduce flooding and subsidence at the same time. And the outcome of that is this plan, which calls for over $6 billion worth of interventions. And many aspects, a few aspects of these are actually in design and under construction. So the city is spending probably close to $300 million over the last few years and in the years ahead through hazard mitigation and national disaster resilience funds to build pilot projects and to build the beginnings of green infrastructure networks and blue-green corridors. The third is a different kind of story. The Broadmoor Lives campaign relates directly to another planning process. The Bring New Orleans Back Commission famously proposed after the floods of Katrina, proposed that certain low-lying areas should be designated for parks and green space. On the one hand, it makes perfect sense. Many of these areas designated are below sea level, and would it make sense to rebuild in those areas that are below sea level? Our mayor today, Mayor LaToya Cantrell, is mayor in part because of the fight that she mounted in the Broadmoor neighborhood. That's the bottom left green dot that she mounted, this triumph of grassroots advocacy. The Broadmoor Lives campaign was a neighborhood's residents, many of whom who hadn't even returned yet, asserting their right to determine the future of their neighborhood and to not be told by planners that they shouldn't live where they had lived previously. And this graphic by the local paper resulted in such fierce backlash that the mayor, Ray Nagin, immediately backed away from the plan, disowned it, and nothing became of it. And so this question of, does it make sense to live below sea level, is essentially kicked down the road. And we don't talk about it anymore, really. So Mayor LaToya Cantrell, she was the head of the Broadmoor Improvement Association at the time. From there, she became a city council member. And today she is the mayor of the city. And infrastructure is a big part of her program. The last thing is not so much a story, it's really a condition that for those of us who live in New Orleans, for everyone who is alive today, I don't think any of us have a memory of the river breaking through its banks. And so this is a view from the Mississippi, that's Jackson Square. And we tell people who are visiting or coming here that the ground next to the river is the most stable. And I think it's important to think about why that is. Again, how are these levees built up and what they're trying to protect. So the framework I'd like to offer is twofold. One, that at the top of each of these, each story relates to a certain definition of risk. I think as good planners and designers, we always start off our processes with a good problem definition. And if we can just define the problem well enough, then it'll make figuring out the solution so much easier. And I think that's a sort of truism and a basic way of working that we take for granted. And to look at what the results are, I tried to think about each of those stories in relation to the solution that is manifest. If we think about the August 5th floods of 2017 as a failure of government and bureaucracy and public agencies, our solution, of course, these are oversimplified, but our solution to these failures is to actually strengthen our levees and build bigger pumps. If the issue is flooding and subsidence, the urban water plan calls for building green infrastructure and integrating that into the existing gray systems. If we believe that it's problematic to live below sea level, as a planner and a designer with access to a lot of data, I know that the bowl of the city will fill up again at some point. We cannot pump indefinitely, even on a sunny day like today. There are constant duty pumps that are cycling on and off to keep the bowl from filling up. If we believe that that's a problem, we can state that as a problem, then a possible solution would be to start to transition low-lying neighborhoods to higher ground. And then the last, if we believe that the problem is the fact that the river is held in check, that's no longer allowed to break through its banks, that it's actually natural for the river to form crevasses and to flood overbank flooding each spring in order to deposit fresh soils and fresh water on the delta, to build the delta, then perhaps the obvious solution would be to allow the river to be free again and to flood low-lying areas and deposit sediment. I would argue that in the present day, in New Orleans, in Southeast Louisiana, there's a very narrow range of politically acceptable solutions that you can talk about. There's no politician or planner for that matter who in their right mind would venture to say that we should depopulate low-lying neighborhoods, much less talk about a river changing course. And so we restrict ourselves to talking about better pumping systems, better maintenance, and we talk a little bit about green infrastructure. And I just want to connect this back to how we define risk. For every politically acceptable solution, there's a politically acceptable problem definition. I'll just add in terms of thinking about the river being held in check, you might add to that indigenous ways of life that are actually connected to a river that's flowing, that those are also made impossible with the current system. So if our goal as planners and designers is to think holistically about resilience and to think every day we think about risk, then what about all of these? If we know fundamentally that people are actually at great risk when they live below sea level, how do we content ourselves with just focusing on what's on the left? Is that okay? For example, we're working in the Gentilly Resilience District in a neighborhood that's below sea level. The city is investing $141 million of HUD funding. And all of that is being invested in green infrastructure that is below sea level. Again, it's not politically acceptable. And so we don't even think about the possible solutions that might result in different forms of resilience and different forms of risk management in the long term. So my argument here is that our work is inherently political. Our work shapes how money flows. Our work shapes who has power and who doesn't. And if we don't recognize that, we run the risk of doing as much harm as good. Something that's been super useful to me over the years is the EPA's environmental education continuum. On the far left, you have awareness, and on the far right, this sort of holy grail of environmental education is stewardship. And I think about the stuff in the middle and who gets to do this work. And I've come to think about our work as planners and designers and engineers as that stuff: critical thinking, problem solving, decision making. And to me, I think it's really difficult to jump to stewardship when you don't have a chance to engage in critical thinking, problem solving, decision making. And so often we ask the public, the communities we work within or work on behalf of, we ask people to jump from awareness and knowledge to stewardship. So where does this leave us? I think there are a couple of things we can do. I'm going to just show this example to show how I think they're all connected. A friend of mine who works in Miami-Dade let me be a fly on the wall on a resilience planning workshop back in 2018 that the Army Corps was leading with a lot of the resilience professionals in that region. On the left is I'm sure you've all seen this, visual preference survey that came the day before when there was a public engagement process. On the right is the actual planning meeting that took place the next day. Even this minimal form of engagement where people are asked to express preferences in relation to millions and billions of dollars worth of projects through these thumbnail images, even this drawing had been rolled up and set aside, while this room of, and I'll add, there's one person of color in that entire room, sat down to do the real work of talking about resilience, defining risk, recurrence intervals, so on and so forth. And so I would suggest three things, or these are ways in which I try to structure my work. I'd love to hear what people think. I think the first is that instead of investing so much in infrastructure, we would do well to invest just as much, if not more, in people and shared knowledge, building the capacity of communities to think critically as a collective, rather than hoarding that work of critical thinking and problem solving to ourselves. I think that starts in schools. As co-founder and current board member for Ripple Effect, where we develop water literacy curriculum and teacher training to bring water issues into local classrooms. And I think when you do that, you see these amazing things. Kids who on their own are thinking about change over time. Kids who are able to think about the ethics of flood protection and think on behalf of communities. Kids who are able to think about what a levee system is in relation to their community. I think it's not just environmental education, it's working with adults, it's working with teachers, it's being out in the field, rubbing different kinds of soils between your fingers, visiting pump stations and understanding the scale of our infrastructure. And it's even our political leaders. One of the things I learned from Tanya James, who is the woman in the striped shirt, is that political leaders so often don't have a chance to not know, don't often have a chance to be wrong. So last fall, we were able to lead a workshop and a tour with Mayor Cantrell and 20 of our departmental heads, where we did exactly what we would do for a group of teachers or a group of students. And it's thinking about how to integrate learning and curiosity about water systems into as many forms of media and platforms as possible. So this was a print feature that went out in the Times-Picayune last December, just sharing information and stories about New Orleans pump stations so that, and their operators, so that when we talk about the Distributed Water Board, it's not just a faceless bureaucracy, but an understanding of who these people are. The second, I think we have to build new tools and processes. Working with Ripple Effect teachers, one of the things that we discovered was, what if instead of requiring everyone to know how to draw, what if we used blue pieces of paper to signify water and people can move those around on a plan? What if in community design workshops, this is work I'm doing for the St. Anthony Green Streets project, we can use collage and we can use stencils to support people who don't have technical expertise in training and drawing and design to create their own drawings and for their ideas to be manifest in these ways that can be included into official drawing sets and analyzed because of the knowledge that is inherent in each resident. And third, critically, it doesn't matter how much you invest in people or new tools if it doesn't actually reshape the politics of planning. If we don't rethink community engagement as an act of trying to get people to show up to your meetings and to respond to your plans, I think what we have to do is actually rethink who's creating these plans. Because the creation of these plans, of these renderings, of these diagrams, is a form of power. So as we come to a close, I think about all the different planning processes that are happening. And I think it's incumbent upon us to think about how our work connects not just to other planning processes, but also the broader social movements that are at play. How does our work relate to Black Lives Matter? How does our work relate to Indigenous rights? Our work really has to be in service of those larger movements, or else I think we really are allowing ourselves to define our work too narrowly. Again, invest in people, build shared knowledge, build new tools and processes, reframe our work, how we do it, who does it, I think is a critical question. Why and when and how it happens. And I think COVID has been an amazing opportunity for us all to think about the ways in which the disasters, I think we know from ecological principles that there's really no such thing as an extreme storm. It's the society, the community, the ecosystem that storm happens to. We know with COVID, it's a matter of who has housing, who has stable employment, who has access to technology. We know that changes in those systems would change the outcomes of COVID. And so similarly, we know that climate change will have differential and disproportionate impacts on different communities. And so our work can't just be about the metrics that we're familiar with, but has to be about everything outside of climate change, everything outside of sea level rise. So this is the last thing I'll show. When I ask this question of how do we define living with water and climate adaptation, again, I think it's critically a question of who gets to define living with water and climate adaptation and how that happens. I remember making this set of diagrams, thinking about how the urban water plan, this is back in 2013, as a rational, thoughtful, well-meaning planner, how the urban water plan could be implemented over time. It's such a neat, I'm sure many of you have created similar drawings, whether it's an implementation chart or a drawing like this. It all made sense. But I've come to realize this kind of drawing is fundamentally problematic. Because I am a designer and a visual thinker, I'll just use one last set of drawings to sort of provide a metaphor for how I think we should be working. Last fall, as part of a group working on the Anthropocene River campus, we brought a lot of people together to explore the river over the course of 2 days, people from different fields. Throughout, we used drawing as a tool. We collected specimens from the field, and we wrapped up on our final day with a giant drawing where we asked everyone to place what they saw to form their own connections and to add additional insights and observations. This 30-foot long drawing was a mess. And then we broke people into groups, multidisciplinary groups, and we asked each group to imagine a new kind of river. And I think that it's this kind of drawing that requires many hands, that relies on the creativity and the imagination of everyone at the table. It's this kind of drawing that we need to be creating rather than the single-minded drawings that we're so used to as planners. If you're interested in learning more about some of these efforts, co-lead the Water Leaders Institute and a burgeoning co-op. And then along the bottom are some of the different efforts that I've been lucky to work on over the years. So, thank you all. Sorry I ran over a little.
Thank you, Aron. That was wonderful. It's a lot to think about. And I think, you know, we all probably think about some of the projects we're involved in and have worked on and how we might revisit them with some of your reflections on the way these projects shape communities. I'm going to open the floor to questions. If people want to unmute themselves or raise a hand, we'll take a few minutes and then we'll send everyone into breakouts as time allows.